bum 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 ba-dum bum bum. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday night, the fourth night of Hanukkah. Let's light up the darkness. Where is everybody? Must be a big football game or something in the news. I don't know. Welcome, Shandora in the Bronx, Joe, wishing everyone Hag Hanukkah Sameach, Bella in Florida, Duncan in Alabama, Bill in mid-Missouri, Ella says Shalom, Joe in Lowell, Massachusetts, on another device, coming back from the base Midrash, Sharon in New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Randy Cohen for the healing of Kalman Moshe ben Baila. May Kalman Moshe ben Baila have a refuah shlema, a complete healing of body, mind, soul, spirit, everything, and may it be speedy, and we say amen. And Randy, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Big daf tonight. Controversial, as I mentioned yesterday. And I gotta say something fascinating that I have found here. Normally I am teaching the daf every day out of the Koren Talmud, Koren Talmud Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, with the elucidation of Rav Adin Steinsaltz. But the first time I made my journey through Daf Yomi, I used the Art Scroll Talmud Bavli. And I've mentioned a few times in the past, I think that for our format, our class, etc., this is maybe a little bit more user-friendly, a lot fewer notes. The translation's just very nice. And I like that when there's a question of halacha, of law, of Jewish law, there's always a category of footnotes there. What is the law? According to Shulchan Aruch, where did this debate in the Gemara or in the Mishna end up? How was the law declared by our sages? Now, the Art Scroll, like I said, has a lot more footnotes, a lot, more commentators addressing every point. And more historical notes. I mean, it's in a slightly different flavor of the translation. But what was so interesting here, so we're gonna be talking about this ruling that makes the modern ear perk up, right? That if the ox of a Jew gores the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt from paying damages. But if the ox of the Canaanite gores the ox of the Jew, the Canaanite is liable to pay the Jew full damages, even if it's a tam, even if it's an innocuous ox. So that non-parallel seeming imbalance is something that not only our ear perks up about, but commentators, since the time of the Talmud, for these last 1,500 years have been talking about this quite a bit, and we'll get into some of those notes. But what I found so interesting is that there's a variation in the Hebrew in the Mishnah, which continues as the Mishnah is cited in the Gemara when we compare the Art Scroll with the Koren. So what the Koren says is that when the ox of the Jew gores the ox of the Gentile, right, of the non-Jew, whereas the Art Scroll says when the ox of the Jew gores the ox of the Canaanite. Now, obviously, that's a big difference. I mean, they're both non-Jews, but, the Gentile includes all non-Jews, and the Canaanite does not. It only includes the non-Jews living in Canaan, right? In Canaan, in the Holy Land. So what's going on here? I don't know. I don't know the answer, how the Hebrew is different. I've never seen that before. I often, look stuff up in the Art Scroll as I prepare for our class, and I haven't seen that there's a just complete difference, not only sometimes there's different translations. For instance, today we'll talk about the Samaritan, right? So the Samaritan is how we always refer to what's in Hebrew, the Kuti. in the text, which here in the Art Scroll they translate as the Cuthian, right? A kind of more literal translation, but it means the Samaritan as we understand it. But the word kuti is the same, in the Hebrew, and when it's cited in the Aramaic, it's the same. That there should be, the word goy, which just means Gentile. It's not an offensive word at all. It simply means nation. Really, all it means is nation. And what it means to is the nations that are not Israel. It says the ox of the goy in the Koran, and it says the ox of the Canaani, the Canaanite, here in the Art Scroll. Now, that might be caused because sometimes there are variations in the text. It might be, and we'll see that there's historical context. It's even part of the Gemara. It might be that language was changed, for the protection of a Jewish community, 1,000 years ago or more than 1,000 years ago, and that it said goy originally and it was changed to Canaanite. I'm not sure. I need to do a little bit more research on that question. But at any rate, I'm going to use the Art Scroll today, not so much because of that difference between Goy and Canaani, but just to give you a little bit of the flavor. I think we should do this now. I feel like the level of the class, has really come up. I'm so proud of everybody in this class. We're doing great as a class. And so it's good to hear kind of the way the translation, the way the nuance of the translation is different, and some of the notes. And particularly, I'm interested in one of the notes today that I will share with you when we get to it. Okay, so our daf is page 38 here in Tractate Bava Kamma. We're working our way, discussing the third Mishna of chapter 4, and God willing, we'll get to, we won't open Mishna number 4 today, but we'll complete our discussion of Mishna number 3 here in chapter 4 of Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. Okay, we picked this up near the top of page 38a with the discussion in our Mishnah. If the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt. But if the ox of a Canaanite gored the ox of a Jew, whether the ox that gored was a tam, an innocuous ox, or a muad, a forewarned ox, the Canaani pays full damages. Now, the Gemara questions this ruling, right? So right away, they question it even in the time of the Gemara. And they said, however you consider this matter, it is difficult. If his fellow, right? So it says in the Torah, if your ox gores the ox of your fellow. Now, the Koran translated that of another, right? But here it's translated as your fellow. And so your fellow refers to your fellow Jew. Or does it? That's the question. So however you consider this matter, it is difficult. If his fellow is meant literally, then when the ox of a Canaani gores the ox of a Jew, the Canaani should be exempt. And if his fellow is not meant literally, meaning that just means any other person living in the land with you, then even when the ox of a Jew gores the ox of a Canaani, the Jew should be liable. There should be no difference between a Jew damaging a Canaanite and a Canaanite damaging a Jew. So on what basis does the Mishnah differentiate between them? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Abahu said, the verse stated, this is a nice thing in there. It always has the citation in line, but this is from Habakkuk 3:6. The verse stated, God arose and judged the land. He saw and released the nations. And what is meant by he saw and released the nations? This means that he, God, saw the 7 commandments that the descendants of Noah, meaning all humanity, which includes the Canaanites, accepted. He saw the 7 commandments that the descendants of Noah accepted upon themselves. Since the Canaanites did not keep the commandments, he arose and released their money to Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that the Jews can go and take anything that belongs to the Canaanites. It means that only with respect to this law of the ox goring, that there's going to be this imbalance. And the Gemara answers that really a Canaanite whose ox gores the ox of a Jew should be exempt, for his fellow is meant literally. He and the Jew are not fellows. So just as we're exempt if our ox gores his ox, he should be exempt if his ox gores ours. However, as a result of their failure to keep the 7 Noahide commandments, God penalized the Canaanites by obligating them to pay in full for this kind of damage. Now, this is actually not that surprising, and this is why it makes sense that we're talking about the Canaani and not, generally speaking, the Gentile. Because who is the Canaani? The Canaani is the non-Jew who lives in the Holy Land and is not a Ger Toshav. The Ger Toshav is who? That is the resident alien. And the Gemara, I've talked about this before, defines in Tractate Avodah Zarah, I believe page 64b, that the Ger Toshav is the non-Jew who seeks to live among the Jews in the Holy Land, and he's permitted to do that so long as he accepts upon himself the 7 mitzvahs, the Noahide laws, right? So number 1, as defined in Tractate Sanhedrin, page 56b, number 1, to establish courts of law, a justice system. Number 2, to recognize that God created the world, so you don't curse God. Number 3, don't blaspheme, meaning don't commit idolatry, don't worship other gods. Don't rape, don't murder, don't steal, and don't eat a limb from a living animal. So if the non-Jew living in Israel accepts these laws upon himself, then he's considered the Ger Toshav, and he would be your fellow. Right? And so then, and it says this further on, and so then if our ox gores his or vice versa, he's included in our law. So the Canaanite is one who is not a law-abiding citizen, is one who does not accept these mitzvahs, the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, the 7 Noahide laws, in which all human beings are obligated. I mean, they're pretty basic laws, you know, pretty just a matter of decency, right? To have a justice system and to obey the law and have courts of law, not murder, not rape, not steal, etc. So you can see that if he doesn't accept that upon himself, we're talking about a very wild and unruly people. And if they're living, you know, in Canaan, in the Holy Land, alongside of us, you can see how it's problematic, right? Now, here is the law, here is the note that I wanted to share with you. This is footnote 7 here on page 38a of the Art Scroll. The Gemara is saying that the verse, his fellow, is indeed meant literally. And it does indeed exclude a Canaanite, who is not regarded as the fellow of a Jew. He's not the Ger Toshav either. And this is why a Jew is exempt when his ox gores the ox of a Canaanite. By rights, this should also exempt the Canaanite from paying when his ox gores the ox of a Jew. Nevertheless, a Canaanite must pay. For God imposed a penalty upon the Canaanites because of their failure to keep the 7 universal laws of mankind, of humankind. And this follows the view of Tosafos as explained by the Maharshal. Now, Rambam, Maimonides, explains the rationale behind punishing the Canaanites in this manner. The Canaanites do not follow the rule of law, i.e., they do not fulfill the universal commandment requiring them to establish a legal system. Therefore, they take no precautions against damaging the property of others. Hence, it is necessary to penalize them, to provide them with an incentive to keep their oxen from damaging others. Similarly, Rabbeinu Yehonasan writes that the penalty was enacted because the Canaanites who adhered to no law gave little heed to the rights of their fellow men. God therefore found it necessary to penalize them so that they would take steps to keep their oxen from damaging others. It emerges that this penalty was no mere punishment for wrongdoing, but was a form of corrective discipline designed to remedy the Canaanite lack. They failed to institute the rule of law on their own, so they were made to do so by means of this penalty. The Meiri stresses that this penalty is strictly limited to nations that do not possess a system of law. Thus, it has little relevance today, for in these times, most nations have devised codes of law and justice. Right? It's a very interesting note there. All right, let's keep going. Right. So the Gemara gives another scriptural source for this penalty. Rabbi Yochanan said it is known from here, and this is from Deuteronomy 33:2. God revealed from Mount Paran, meaning he revealed himself to Israel at Sinai after the nations refused his law at Mount Paran. And from this verse, we see that the nations were penalized for refusing to keep God's law. And the verse is expounded as follows. From Paran, he revealed their money to Israel, i.e., he penalized them by requiring them to pay in full for damages inflicted by their oxen. Accordingly, although a Canaanite is not the fellow of a Jew, if his ox gores the ox of a Jew, he is liable. And the Gemara cites a baraisa in support of this. This has also been taught in a baraisa. If the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt. But if the ox of a Canaanite gored the ox of a Jew, whether the ox was a tam or a muad, an innocuous ox or a goring ox, the Canaanite pays full damages. For it is stated, he arose and judged the land, he saw and released the nations, and a verse states he revealed from Mount Paran. So the Gemara questions the need for two verses. Why do we need two verses? One from Habakkuk and one from Deuteronomy. What is the purpose of... and the verse states, having cited one source, why must the Baraisa cite another? And the Gemara explains, the Baraisa is saying the following, and if you will say, this verse, he arose and judged the land, he saw and released the nations, is needed for the teachings of Rav Mishna and Rav Yosef, and thus cannot be used for this teaching, then come learn another proof he revealed from Mount Paran, which teaches from Paran he revealed, exposed their money to Israel for the purposes of this law of the ox. So the Gemara identifies the teachings of Rav Mishna and Rav Yosef. What is the teaching of Rav Mishna? For Rav Mishna said, he arose and judged the land. He saw vayater, the nations. What did he see? He saw the 7 commandments in which the descendants of Noah were commanded and which these nations did not keep. In punishment, he arose and exiled them from their land. And Rav Mishna understands the word vayater as referring to his exile from the nations. God's exile of the nations. So the Gemara asks, and where is it indicated that this word vayater is a term that denotes exile? For it is written here, vayater, the nations. And it is written there regarding the flying sheratzim that one may eat, right? There are certain insects that are kosher, is the one that has jumping legs above its legs, lenater, upon the earth. And this is translated as to jump upon the earth. So we see the term lenater connotes jumping from place to place. And so too, the related term vayater, it connotes the jumping or exile of nations from one place to the other. And this is Rav Mishna's exposition, right? We've seen many times in history that a people arose and went from one place to another and settled there, right? There's many nations, You look at like who were the people that settled England, who were the people that settled France, Scandinavians, came from one place to another. The Mongols came and defeated one empire. There's movement of peoples over time, and nations disappear, right? Peoples disappear. Where am I? So the Gemara asks, I just did that. So the Gemara turns now to Rav Yosef's exposition. And what is this teaching that was mentioned of Rav Yosef? For Rav Yosef stated, he arose and judged the land. He saw and released the nations, etc. What did God see? He saw the 7 commandments that the descendants of Noah accepted upon themselves and which they did not keep. In response, he arose and made the commandments permissible to them, i.e., he released the nations from the commandments. Now, this is very interesting. We don't hold, we don't hold by Rav Yosef in this. We say that the 7 Noahide commandments are incumbent on all people of the world. Rav Yosef is saying that, well, they were given to all the people of the world. They didn't keep it. So God said, you know what? Fine. You're not obligated in it. Really? Why would he say that? So this means that the nations are no longer obligated to fulfill the 7 universal commandments. And the Gemara asks, but it then emerges that they have gained by their misdeeds, for their sins have freed them from obligation and punishment. If so, we find that a sinner has profited from his transgression, and this cannot be. So the Gemara explains Rav Yosef's teaching. Mar, the son of Ravina, said, it is to say that even if the nations fulfill the 7 commandments, they receive no reward for observing them. It does not, however, free them from punishment if they transgress. Thus, their release from obligation represents no benefit. Now, that's not the law. The nations are. All the non-Jews of the world are obligated. All the people of the world, including the Jews, are obligated in the 7 Noahide commandments. Now, the Gemara questions this assertion. What do you mean they don't receive reward? But it has been taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Meir says, from where do we know that even a non-Jew, if he engages in Torah study, is like a Kohen Gadol, is like the high priest serving in the temple? For regarding the laws of the Torah, it is stated that man shall perform and by which he shall live. It is not stated in the verse that Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim, the priests and the Levites and the regular Jews shall perform, but rather it says that man, humankind, shall perform. Man means any human being, Jews as well as non-Jews. You have thus learned that even a non-Jew, if he engages in Torah study, is like the high priest. And we see from this Baraisa that non-Jews do receive reward for keeping God's law. That is a really, remember, if you ever need the source for this, Bava Kamma 38a is where it says that when non-Jews engage in Torah study, they receive a huge reward. Now the Gemara answers, so this is now stated, Rabbi Meir's teaching, as a challenge to Rav Yosef, who said that because the nations didn't keep the Noahide commandments, that they lost their reward for keeping them. So the Gemara answers, well, they said, now this would be Rav Yosef's answer. Well, they said they do not receive for their deeds the reward of one who acts to perform a precept having been commanded to do so, but of one who acts without having been commanded. For Rabbi Hanina said, one who acts to perform a precept having been commanded to do so is greater than one who acts without having been commanded. Since the nations were released from the obligation to perform the 7 commandments, they do not receive the greater reward of one who acts in accordance with the command. Now, this is a general principle that there's a greater reward for fulfilling a law in the Torah that you're obligated to fulfill. You receive a greater reward for fulfilling what you're obligated to do than what is optional for you to do. There's a greater reward for fulfilling obligations, right? And we've discussed that before. We're a little bit behind, so I'm just going to keep going. So Rav Yosef is saying that if the nations indeed are no longer obligated in the Noahide commandments, then when they fulfill them, they avoid punishment, but they don't receive the reward of one who is obligated. That, as I said, the law is not according to Rav Yosef in this regard. Now, the Gemara cites a related Baraisa. The rabbis taught in a Baraisa, the Roman government, this is a really interesting story, the Roman government once sent 2 officers to the sages of Israel saying, teach us your Torah. Now, the Roman government, you understand, is the great oppressor of the Jewish people. Obviously, they destroyed the Second Temple, which was never rebuilt. And throughout that whole period, right, late Second Temple period from when the Romans came into power, destroying the Second Temple in the year 70, and eventually crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135. And by the year 200 of the Common Era, right, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had to write down that which was meant to remain an oral tradition because that Roman persecution was so severe, right? So generally speaking, when the sages referred to the wicked empire, they're talking about Rome. So the Roman government once sent 2 officers to the sages of Israel, saying, "Teach us your Torah." They read it once, reviewed it, and then read it a 3rd time. When they were leaving, the officers said to the sages, "We have carefully examined your entire Torah, and it is all true. Except for that which you say, if the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew is exempt. If the ox of a Canaanite gored the ox of a Jew, whether the ox was an innocuous or a forewarned ox, the Canaanite pays full damages. For however you consider the matter, it is difficult. If his fellow is meant literally, then even when the ox of a Canaanite gores the ox of a Jew, the Canaanite should be exempt. And if his fellow is not meant literally, then even when the ox of a Jew gores the ox of a Canaanite, the Jew should be liable. And this law makes no sense. Said the Romans, however, we will not reveal this matter to the authorities, lest it jeopardize your welfare. So this seems to be that these Roman officers were moved by everything that they learned in the Torah and didn't want to endanger the Jewish people. And indeed, there are many stories in the Talmud of even though there's this overall oppression coming from Rome toward Judaism and the Jews in the Holy Land, nevertheless, there were many individuals who really respected the sages and the Torah, some of whom converted, like the famous Josephus. Josephus was a Jew, but Onkelos, right? Was Onkelos Roman? I think he was. Pretty sure he was. But at any rate, there's a few stories of Roman even emperors who had good relationships. I mean, the most famous of which was Vespasian, who was sent to destroy Jerusalem and the Second Temple, and ended up having an interaction with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, allowed him to escape from Jerusalem and to set up the new seat of learning in Yavne. And there's a bunch of stories like that. Okay, let's keep going. So now the Gemara digresses, and I'm not sure based on what. Page 20, note 27, the previous Gemara and the forthcoming one appear superficially to be unconnected. However, Meiri implies a connection between them. The previous Gemara spoke of the reward that accrues to a non-Jew who studies Torah, and the forthcoming Gemara will lead into one that teaches that God does not ever withhold reward for a righteous act. So that's the link between what we just read and this next teaching. So Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda's daughter died. And the rabbis said to Ula, right? Ula is this, well-known sage with a very sharp tongue, who often traveled between the sages in Israel and the sages in Bava, right, in Babylonia. And he was kind of a link between those two communities and often brought teachings back and forth between them. So the rabbis said to Ula, let us go console him, right? Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, whose daughter died. So Ula said to them, what have I to do with the consolation of you Babylonians? It is blasphemy against the one above. For when they console the bereaved, the Babylonians, meaning the Babylonian Jews, say what can be done. And this implies that if there was something that could be done to reverse God's decree, they would do it. And this is blasphemy. So instead, Ula went to Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda alone. He didn't want to be accompanied by the other Babylonians. And he said to him, the verse states, and Hashem said to me, Moses, do not oppress Moab and do not incite war against them. Now, why would it have arisen in Moses' thought to wage war against Moab without the Almighty's permission? For Moses reasoned to himself by means of a kal v'chomer. He said, if regarding the Midianites who came to war against Israel only to assist Moab, and the Torah states, oppress the Midianites and smite them, then regarding the Moabites themselves, who instigated the hostilities against Israel, is it not certain that Israel should wage war against them? And so now Ula gives God's answer. The Holy One, blessed be He, said, not that which has arisen in your thought has arisen in my thought, right? My thoughts are unknowable to you, right? Meaning that God says my thoughts are incomprehensible to you, right? Not that which has arisen in your thought has arisen in my thought. I do not desire the destruction of Moab, nor of its sister nation Ammon. Why? For there are two fine pigeons that I must first draw forth from them, Ruth the Moabite and Naamah the Ammonite. And to ensure the emergence of these future descendants of Moab and Ammon, God forbade Moses to wage war against these nations. Right? God can see all of the past and all of the future and all of the present, and God has a plan. So even though you might think that if God ordered us to destroy Midian because they tried to destroy the Jewish people, but only in terms of assisting Moab in attacking the Jewish people, and God told us, to attack Midian, so you might think, well, of course He would have us attack Moab, but He didn't tell us to attack Moab. Why? And Ula is explaining, because God had a plan, right? That Ruth, like the book of Ruth, she was a Moabitess, and so Moab couldn't be destroyed yet. There is no Moab today, so eventually Moab disappeared from the earth, but not before giving birth to Ruth. And likewise, the Ammonites are gone from this world, but they first had to provide this biblical character, Naamah. So to ensure the emergence of these future descendants of Moab and Ammon, God forbade Moses to wage war against these nations. Now, Ula concludes, remember, he's there to console Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yehuda on the loss of his daughter. So now Ula says, now, is this matter not a basis for a kal v'chomer regarding your daughter? For on account of only two fine pigeons, the Holy One, blessed is He, showed mercy to two large nations and did not destroy them. Likewise, with regard to my teacher's daughter, had she been righteous and worthy of having righteous descendants emerge from her, how much more certain is it that she would have lived? And this was Ula's condolence to Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. And we're like, what? What? That's a condolence? Did he just say to the father, a grieving father who lost his daughter, that, well, if she had been more righteous, she would have lived longer and merited to have children? She was taken from this world, so it must be that, she didn't merit to have children for some, reason that she wasn't righteous enough. Is that what Ula just said? How could that? Who would ever say such a thing to a parent? Listen. Here's the note. Ula's condolence, well, in other words, so here's the full note. That is, if God grants life to a whole nation of sinners because of the eventual emergence of a righteous descendant, He will certainly grant life to a single individual from whom some righteous person will descend in the future. Ula's condolence emphasizes the justice of God's decree. It also addresses the sorrow of a father who feels that his child died without fulfilling her purpose in life. Ula explained that the girl had certainly left none of her potential unrealized. Had it been possible for her to have descendants, God would certainly have allowed her to live. Her death was a sure sign that she had already fulfilled all her purpose on this world. Now, as far as this law is concerned, is this a way to console a mourner? Yam Shel Shlomo notes that neither the Rif nor the Rosh take a stance in this matter. They evidently hold that one may console a mourner in any manner he deems fitting. However, the Yam Shel Shlomo suggests that one refrain from imitating Ula's consolation, as it may cause pain to the bereaved to hear that his child was not virtuous enough to merit righteous offspring. It is most preferable to honor both the bereaved and the deceased by extolling the virtues of the deceased. I mean, this is very difficult to understand, but I think what they're saying is, and remember, this is in a context that it was well understood, by the whole community in the Gemara of the sages, that there is a Jewish notion of reincarnation, of a Gilgul or Gilgulim, right? And so this idea is that when a child dies, It's because they've already accomplished their purpose in this world. The soul has already come down, has lived a lifetime. Something was unfinished, needed to come back for a short time. And so when a child dies, God forbid, what's indicated is this is a very righteous person who just needed a little bit of more time in this world and now has completed what they needed to do in this world, right? We come back for reincarnations because there's work that is undone, penance that needs to be done, stuff that we need to work through. A child is automatically understood to be a righteous soul. And so that, she didn't need to have children in this world. Her soul has already been here, has had offspring, has completed the job that she was sent here to do. And so what Ula was saying is, have no fear. Your daughter has fulfilled her destiny. She has righteous offspring from a previous lifetime. It's all good. But don't try this at home, folks. Right? We don't console a mourner the way Ula did when Ula was speaking to a fellow sage that had all of this, knowledge and understanding in their grasp. Normally what we do, first of all, when we console a mourner, we just go and sit with them. And we don't even say anything unless they want to talk and they open the conversation, and then we lend a listening ear. And exactly, if we're going to say anything, we're going to just listen to stories about the person who has passed from this world. And if we knew them, to share, what joy, what inspiration, what meaning they gave us, what they taught us, how they inspired us, how much we admired them, etc. The Gemara discusses further the divine command not to wage war against Moab and contrasts it with the command regarding Moab's sister nation, Ammon. Now, Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the Holy One, blessed is he, does not withhold the reward of any creature, even the reward earned for refined speech. How do we know this? For in the case of Lot's firstborn daughter, right? Remember Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Lot was living in Sodom, right? In Sodom. And so when, God told Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham sort of negotiated with God, well, what if there are righteous people there? And ultimately, God said, well, okay, if I find 10 righteous people there, I won't destroy it. But evidently there weren't 10 righteous people there. And so Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. But Lot and his family were saved in the merit of Lot's uncle, Abraham. Unfortunately, Lot's wife is the one who turned around and looked at the destruction behind her. She turned into a pillar of salt. And so who ended up being rescued? Lot and his 2 daughters, right? He had other daughters and sons-in-law who laughed at their uncle when he said, we need to get out of here and save ourselves. And so they all perished in Sodom and Gomorrah. What ended up happening was that Lot and his 2 daughters were kind of hiding in the mountains as they saw sulfur and fire raining down from heaven and destroying everything in the region. And those daughters and Lot, while they were hiding in the mountains, they thought maybe they're the last humans on earth. And so to sort of propagate humanity, those girls ended up sleeping with their father and getting pregnant by him, right? And these are the ancestors of Moab and Ammon, right? And so let's learn more about them. For in the case, and now we're talking about getting a reward for anything that you do that's righteous, even having refined speech. So in the case of Lot's firstborn daughter, who, when naming the son she bore from her father, named him Moab, which literally means from father, like she's advertising that, this is her son by incest, thus recalling the incestuous union. The Holy One, blessed is he, said to Moses regarding the descendants of the nation of Moab, do not oppress Moab and do not incite war against them. This implies that it is war that may not be waged against them. Levies, however, may be enacted upon them. But in the case of Lot's younger daughter, who, when naming her son, born of her father, named him Ben-Ami, son of my people, which does not explicitly recall the child's illegitimate origins, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to Moses concerning her descendants, the nation of Ammon, and you shall approach opposite the children of Ammon, do not oppress them, and do not incite against them. By omitting mention of war, the verse implies that no form of incitement is allowed, meaning that even levies may not be enacted upon them. This added protection with the reward for the refined speech of their ancestor, Lot's younger daughter. And this demonstrates that God bestows reward even for so small a matter as refined speech. In other words, and we've seen this always in the Talmudic understanding of the world, the Jewish understanding of the world, we are accountable for every deed we've ever committed. For good or for bad, there will be a weighing, a balancing, and reward for every good deed, and accountability for every transgression, and then exactly where that balance ends up is going to have a lot to say about where we go in the next world, right? Remember that the Jewish understanding of the afterlife is not binary, right? It's not heaven and hell. It's the world of souls, and there's an infinite number of levels that you can go to. Within that, if you need purification, you'll be spending time in Gehenna, and then take your place in the world of souls, if indeed you've earned a portion in the world of souls. But, it's not just either top or bottom, it's like infinite levels. And that is because there is accountability and reward for every deed that we perform in this world, even something so small as refined speech. Rabbi Chia bar Abba quotes another teaching derived from the incident of Lot's daughters. And Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, a person should always strive to be first in a mitzvah matter. For because of the one night by which Lot's elder daughter preceded the younger daughter in cohabiting with her father, she preceded her by 4 generations in joining the nation of Israel. Observe, the Jewish descendants of the older daughter were Oved, Yishai, David, and Solomon, whereas the Jewish descendants of the younger daughter did not manifest themselves until the birth of Rechavam, the son of Solomon. For regarding Rechavam, it is written, and his mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. So we see that the offspring of the older daughter were first to join Israel, and this was on account of her being first to perform the mitzvah. What mitzvah? Being fruitful and multiplying, right? In other words, they thought that there would be in this case, incest was not a transgression, even though it's ugly. But they thought that, there would be no humans if they didn't do this. So she was doing it for a holy purpose, to make sure that humanity would continue. The Mishnah discussed cases involving the oxen of Canaanites and Jews. So the Gemara cites a Baraisa that discusses similar cases involving Samaritans and Jews. Here in the art scroll, Kuthians, but we're talking about Samaritans. Remember that the Samaritans were a people that was brought into Israel during the first temple period, when there was the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom. This is when the tribes, the lost tribes of Israel, were the tribes of the northern kingdom that were removed after the Assyrian conquest, and then they resettled the land, right? The colonial oppressor resettled the land with people they brought in. They brought them into Samaria. That's why they're called Samaritans, or here they're just called Kuthians. And those people started to be persecuted by the wild animals, the lions of the land. And they came to understand that in the Holy Land, especially during the first temple period, if people were not following the laws of the Torah, it would be bad for them. So they made a conversion to Judaism, but it was not a wholehearted conversion. There were things that they didn't agree with and didn't, take on. They only believed in the written Torah, etc. And over time, even though they were meticulous about observing some Torah laws, they didn't accept the authority of the sages, and eventually they were just deemed non-Jews. But for a while, they were sort of pseudo-Jews. So The rabbis have taught in a baraisa, if the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Samaritan, the Jew is exempt. But if the ox of a Samaritan gored the ox of a Jew, this is the law. If the ox that gored is a tam, the Samaritan pays half damages. But if it is a muad, the Samaritan pays full damages. And there's a dissent to this. Rabbi Meir says if the ox of a Jew gored the ox of a Samaritan, the Jew is exempt. If the ox of a Samaritan gored the ox of a Jew, whether the ox gored was a tam or a muad, the Samaritan pays full damages. So we see that Rabbi Meir requires Samaritans to pay in full for damage inflicted by their property. And the Gemara assumes that this assumes this to be a function of the general penalty enacted upon non-Jews. Perforce, Rabbi Meir regards Samaritans as non-Jews. And the Gemara demonstrates that this is contradicted by another of Rabbi Meir's rulings. Is this to say that Rabbi Meir holds that Samaritans are lion converts whose conversion was not legally valid because they only did it to avoid getting eaten by lions? So their conversion was not legally valid and who are therefore regarded as non-Jews, but contrast this ruling with that which Rabbi Meir stated in the following Mishna. All bloodstains found on garments that come from Rechem are pure. For the majority of people of Rechem are non-Jews. But Rabbi Yehuda rules them impure because they, the residents of Rechem, are converts to Judaism who are presently erring, making mistakes in their religious observance. If the garments come from among non-Jews, they are pure. If they come from among Jews and from among Samaritans, Rabbi Meir rules them impure. Remember that ritual purity and impurity only applies to Jews. Non-Jews are not obligated in those laws of Tumah and Tahara at all. So if you say that something is impure, it's actually because of the greater obligations that Jews have with respect to ritual purity. So if they come from among Jews and from among Samaritans, Rabbi Meir rules them impure. So that would indicate that Samaritans are obligated in the same Torah laws as the Jews. But the sages rule them pure because both of these groups are not suspect regarding their stains. And the Gemara draws an inference. We see from here, i.e. from the fact that he rules Samaritan garments impure, that Rabbi Meir holds that Samaritans are true converts. And this contradicts his position here. And the Gemara resolves this contradiction. Rabbi Bahu said, indeed, Rabbi Meir holds that Samaritans are valid converts. As for his ruling regarding damage inflicted by or upon Samaritans, it is a penalty that Rabbi Meir placed upon their money so that the Jews would not become intermingled with them. And the Gemara questions Rabbi Bahu's explanation. Rav Zera challenged it on the basis of the following Mishnah. These are the Ne'aros who are entitled to a fine if they are forcibly violated. Right, young women if they are raped. So if one violates a mamzeris or a nesina or a Samaritan, he must pay the fine. And the Gemara develops the question. Now, if it enters your mind that Rabbi Meir placed a penalty upon the money of the Samaritans, then here too, in the case of a Samaritan girl who was violated, we should penalize the Samaritans by exempting the violator from paying the fine so that the Jews will not become intermingled with them. Since the Mishnah does levy a fine upon one who violates a Samaritan, it is evident that the Samaritans were not penalized in this manner. And the Gemara defends Rabbi Abahu. Abaye said in the case of one who violates a Nara, a young woman, the penalty against the Samaritans is not applied so that the sinner will not profit. However, in other instances, such as where the Samaritan's ox damages the ox of a Jew, the penalty is in effect. And that's how we see that with the Samaritans, sometimes they're considered Jews and sometimes not. So the Gemara proposes a way to apply the penalty against the Samaritans, even in the case of a man who raped a Nara. But let us give the violator's fine to the poor. And this would preserve both penalties, that against the rapist and that against the Samaritans. And the Gemara dismisses the suggestion. Rab Mari said this suggestion is untenable because the violator's fine would then be rendered money that has no claimant, making it impossible to extract from the violator. That's what I've got for us today. And with that, we complete our discussion of Mishnah number 3. And we'll pick it up tomorrow with Mishnah number 4. What happens when the ox of a Jew gores the ox of a person who's halakhically incompetent, like a minor. Okay, let's take a few questions or comments on this. We go. Bill. Well, let me come back to Bill. First, Marjorie. The Midrash Tanchuma says that the convert Onkelos was the nephew of Roman Emperor Hadrian. Oh, good. So I remembered that correctly. The story is fantastic, but is one my old brain cells tell me from one of my Aramaic professor's stories. Right? Onkelos was this guy who, he converted. And then I think the Romans didn't like it, and they kept sending like more and more important people telling him, come back to us. And Onkelos kept converting the messengers to Judaism. There's more stories than that. And I mean, Onkelos is one of the most important translations that we have of the Torah. I believe he translated it into Greek. Right? Greek was still a very important language, even in the Roman Empire. Or maybe it was to Aramaic, but at any rate, you're supposed to read Onkelos, like in the Onkelos commentary. Onkelos is still a very important part of the Jewish tradition. So this was somebody who, was not born Jewish, was, as you see, a relative of a Roman emperor, and ended up being one of the great sages of Jewish history. Now, Bill, who's a little bit off topic, he says, funny you mention England and France in your list of migrations. England comes from Angle land, the Angles having been a subset of the Saxons from northern Germany, southern Denmark. And France is from Francia, the land of the Franks. Both of these were populations that moved into the area later. However, while the Anglo-Saxons pushed the Britons west and north to become the Welsh, the Franks intermarried with the previous population of the Gauls, right? So these were just examples of, how the nations of the world move around, and, a people that is considered a people of the land now, those people didn't always live in that land. Very often they came from somewhere else. And Yosef says, Joe Shum says, what halakhic works exist on the topic of the Gerim and the Bnei Noach? And Nina recommended a book called The Path of the Righteous Gentile. Right, and I've done a few videos on it. I mean, so according to Jewish law, and we'll encounter this in Tractate Sanhedrin, page 90, that not only does all Israel have a place in the world to come, I mean, they could lose it if they're extremely evil, but all people have a place in the world to come. What is it that non-Jews have to do in order to earn their place in the world to come, and a lofty, beautiful place in the world of souls? Take upon themselves the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide commandments. And as we've discussed before, they're not so simple, right? In other words, the first law is to have courts of law. Okay, so you have to have a working justice system. And what does that mean? That requires further Torah study. You have to not curse God. Well, who is God, right? God is the God who created the world. God, the God of the Torah. How do you know about God? How do you make sure that you don't curse God? You have to know more about God. That requires Torah study. You have to not commit idolatry. What is idolatry? Requires Torah study, right? So, etc. So there is a huge reward for non-Jews learning Torah, so that they can fulfill the Noahide commandments. But if they do, massive reward. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow to continue our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 4 of Tractate Bava Kamma. Have a great night.